Okay, here we are, back in the mid-70s. I think one of the things that shaped who I am about that time was a strong sense of belonging, of my being and of my belonging and the peer group I hung out with at school, which were stoners, basically stoners. My gay life, which I had to keep hidden, but I felt very strongly about, and I identified very much with what I was learning from Paul about gay culture and my own sexuality. And also at time, I learned how to be creative, how to use my imagination, I think. And all those things stood well by me. I lost all the weight that I acquired when I was pre-adolescent. And by the 7th grade, I was a fat, chubby little kid. By the time I started smoking when I was 14, I just started falling off me. I became thin, my hair got long, and a lot of times I wasn't wearing my glasses, which had been prescribed in the 7th grade. And so I was feeling real good about myself, and being into rock and roll, discovering music, that really just opened up this whole door for me. I started going to concerts, all those bands. I saw all those bands from the mid-70s, rock and roll type stuff. I had a record player, I was buying albums. Rod Stewart was another big favorite with me. Another hand-me-down from my sister. I didn't really start getting into glam. Actually, that boat pretty much passed me by here. It wasn't as big, or as should I say, a teeny bop thing in the U.S. as it was in Britain. So it was. Bowie. I remember seeing Bowie stuff and hearing his songs, but not being real attracted until later on, in 1976. In 1975 I wasn't into that. I was into more like ZZ Top, Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stones. I was into making things out of shells. We'd gone down to Mexico a lot as a kid. When I was a kid, we'd gotten boxes of shells off the beach. I'd make these mobiles, and I'd macrame the hanging part, and then attach that to a piece of driftwood, and then tie fishing line and hang shells from that. And I was like selling those. I would sell those and get it at like $10 for an ounce of pot back then. It was Mexican dirt weed basically, but it was a lot, I'll scare up $5 to go in on halves with somebody and get half an ounce. Just shit like that. Hanging out in front of liquor stores, asking people to buy us booze and drinking it in the schoolyard. Stuff like, real teenage, not even delinquent stuff, but very teenage. Of course, when I was with Paul, he was 29, he could buy booze, so we had quite a few drinking fests. I'll never forget my first introduction to malt liquor. I was with him, and I got so plastered. I don't remember anything. I just know the next day on my left cheek, I had this big old rug burn. The only thing I can think of was I must have been trying to get my head up off the floor and scooting myself along the rug, and I just ended up with a bad old rug burn. So that that year, 1975, was a big watershed year for me. I learned a lot, and from there I went back to school in 1976, and I was in the 11th or 10th grade, and continued that whole pattern of fucking around and just not doing, ditching a lot of school, practically the whole 10th grade. I just didn't bother to go. So by the fall of 1976, I was supposed to enter the 11th grade. It just wasn't working out for me at a regular high school. And I was the one who pointed that out to my mother, who set up an appointment with the school counselor. And we decided, after I'd been in the 11th grade for about a month, this must have been about October of 1976, we decided I would go to the school district's continuation school called Lincoln. And so I transferred there, and it's located in downtown Riverside, a little bit east of the downtown area, an old, primarily Mexican and black section of Riverside, and I loved it there. I was removed from that core group of guys that I used to hang out with, whom I was feeling alienated from anyway because of my sexuality, and I was tired of having to pretend, to be something I wasn't. And at this school, I only had to be there for 5 hours in the morning, and I was given the opportunity. There were required classes I had to take, but it was the ones where, I put minimal effort into to get a passing grade because I wasn't interested in them that much. And then the classes I was interested in, I was really able to excel. The more creative classes, I think it was the first time I was exposed to what would be very different literature from what I'd previously been exposed to. Maybe, I guess, more like 60s type of literature. I was exposed to my first poetry then, and although I didn't start writing until a year later, it left this door open for me that there's more possibilities than the strict, rigid hierarchy of high school, which it's so American. You've got your jocks, which are the people into sports, and their girlfriends, the cheerleaders. You had your socials, what we called socials, which was, I guess, short term for social people, and those were the people that, probably were upper middle class and a little bit snooty. Then the stoners were all just, basically delinquent kids who did drugs and smoked cigarettes. And then there were nerds, but I don't think we called them nerds then. I don't know. But I had narrowly escaped being classified in that group, so like all good kids, I looked down on others who are not in my own peer group or class group. Racially, I think I definitely got more exposure to different races at the continuation school. But I didn't like have a black friend or a Mexican friend or an Oriental friend or anything. I just remember being more aware of them and not being. In the earlier parts of high school, there was always like racial tension, and there was none of that at the school because it was everybody's last chance to have some sort of education. There was no required physical education classes. So, you only had to be there 5 hours, and it was there. I got the credits I needed, and I rehooked up with a childhood friend by the name of Ken Hyde, who I also had sexual encounters with, before we could even come and shit. We'd spend the night at each other's houses and play with our weenies, that kind of thing. He was at this school, and he introduced me to his friend Tim Shepard, who, the three of us, we were all looked upon as the school fags. I remember Tim would definitely dress what you might call glam, in platform clog shoes, and he's already 6'7", and he had long wispy hair, and he was already way into David Bowie. That was probably my first exposure to David Bowie and Roxy Music, and prog rock bands like Gentle Giant. I'm sure I was already listening to things like Yes by that time too. I'd also started listening to Black Sabbath. I distinctly remember the first time that was Jimi Hendrix. The first time I ever smoked hash and listened to Jimi Hendrix was the Electric Ladyland and just being tripped out. But I do remember smoking hash and listening to, it was a Black Sabbath second or third album. Anyway, so from 1970, fall of 76 into 77, I was at this school. I guess it was that fall I bought my first Bowie record, which would have been Low, ironically. Of course, I'd heard his shit on the radio and everything, and, I liked it. I liked it all, I just wasn't into buying his stuff. It was actually, Tim and Ken Hyde that got me listening to something different than what was, the popular things for kids who were 15, 16 to listen to back then. So that by the time punk rock came along, which, I remember reading an article in, was it Circus Magazine or Cream? Maybe it was Cream, in the summer of 75 about the New York scene. It was an article about television, Patti Smith, New York Dolls, Cherry Vanilla, Lance Loud, and the Mumps. And being intrigued, but somewhere I still have that magazine, by the way. It's from the summer of 1975. I forget when exactly, but I started reading more about Patti Smith. I guess I was reading about Patti Smith and Bob Marley right about the same time as Rastaman Vibration came out. And Patti Smith's Horses, that would have been 76. So I bought those two records. I was real into them. Playing them for my friends, and nobody other than Tim got it. And then I guess early in 76, Tim had gotten the first two Ramones albums and turned me on to those. I turned him on to Patti Smith, he turned me on to the Ramones. And we both started hearing little bits and pieces about the Sex Pistols. But I wouldn't be into them until 77. Just a little bits, you know. Oh, and Iggy. Tim turned me on to Iggy Pop about that same period in the 70s, 76. And before I get too far, I guess, into the very beginnings of me being into punk rock, maybe I should also add at the end of this question, this very long answered question, it was in February of 1977 that I first met Christopher Robin Lowe, who was 12 years old, almost 13 at the time, looked almost my age. He had come over with a friend of my brother, and ironically Paul was there. And he'd come in my room, we'd smoke cigarettes, listen to music. My brother was there, and I remember Chris walking past. I was sitting on the edge of my twin bed, and Chris walking past and just looking at his ass and thinking, oh my God, this kid's got a beautiful butt on him. And Paul was checking him out, and he saw the way I was checking him out. He was a little bit jealous about that. But by the beginning of 77, things were not working out with Paul. I still very much loved him, but we were drifting apart because he was jobless. He had lost the place in Pedley, had fights with the guy at the horse ranch and all this shit. And he was basically homeless, living in his van. And Paul had met this older guy, probably in his late